Hello everyone and welcome to The Green Flame, the Deep Green Resistance broadcast that brings you radical analysis, practical skills, and artistic expression from the revolutionary movement to defend the planet and rebuild just human communities. I am your host and comrade, Max Wilbert.
I am your co-host, Jennifer Manan. On this Green Flame podcast, the Deep Green Resistance Book Club discusses Bright Green Lies by Derrick, Jenson, Lierre, Keith, and Max Wilbert. This book is arguably the most important work to arise from the DGR literary community since the publication 10 years ago of Deep Green Resistance. That book, by Lierre, Keith, Derrick, Jenson, and Eric McBay, sparked and formed the foundation for DGR. We thank Beth for leading this discussion on Bright Green Lies, which includes reflections on the documentary film of the same name. We are so grateful to Julia Barnes, the documentary film's creator, for joining us in this conversation.
So, all right. I know some of you have read the book and some of you haven't. Some of you have seen the film. Some of you haven't. The film is by Julia, who is here. Thank you, Julia. That film is based on the book and also her conversations with Derrick, Lierre, Max, and some others. So I'm going to give a quick intro to the book, because since some of you haven't read it, and then we can begin the conversation. So Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It, is a book by Derrick, Jenson, Lierre, Keith, and Max Wilbert. The book describes how the environmental movement has been co-opted in two ways. First, by concerns about climate change and saving humanity and civilization above all other environmental concerns. And second, by industry pushing technology and development. The book first describes the problem with this breakdown in the environmental movement and the switch from concern primarily for saving the natural world to concern about the technologies we can invent and use to save humanity. The rest of the book lays out the ways in which industry and industry's technological promises to save us have co-opted the environmental movement. So each chapter tackles a lie, a technology solution that many environmentalists believe will help us and help the world, and dismantles that belief by showing how the technology will only make our situation worse. These lies include lies about solar, wind, energy storage, recycling, efficiency, hydropower, geothermal, tidal power, and more. All the lies we currently hear about ad nauseum from the current Biden administration and all mainstream environmental organizations. And that's US-centric, and it also happens in other countries. Not only do the authors expose the problems with these supposed solutions, they also teach us the kinds of questions about any proposed solution that we should ask. So questions like, how is that solution made? From what materials? And who lives where those materials must be mined? The key question the authors ask in this book, as they have asked in other writing they've done separately and together, is the point of technology to help the earth, or is it to maintain this way of living at the expense of the earth? In Bright Green Lies, they show the answer to this question is clearly the latter. That is, all technology requires materials and energy, materials that must be mined from the ground, and energy that also requires mining, whether it's fossil fuels or wind and solar technologies and the materials used to make those technologies. The book also includes a real solutions chapter. It's short because the real solutions offered by the authors are simple, although they are not easy. These solutions can be encapsulated primarily by the statement, we need to end industrial civilization. The questions the authors teach us to ask about technology, about industry, are questions that can and should be asked about everything we humans do on planet Earth. And when you start asking these questions, you begin pulling on a thread that doesn't stop until we end industrial civilization. The authors lay out a short recipe for how to do this, including doing the obvious, like restoring all damaged lands and ending all funding for infrastructure projects. This suggestion is especially pertinent today on the eve of a massive new multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan here in the US. This US plan would only add to the massive infrastructure plans currently underway all around the world. All right, so with that, I want to start us off by asking about green and more generally language. Bright Green Lies is the name of the book because that word has been co-opted by corporations. I remember when companies started using green for products, I think it was maybe in the 90s. So like green cleaner to clean things without supposedly toxic chemicals and so on. But now green has been used to describe everything from electric vehicles to nuclear energy. And it really feels like the wholesale co-option of environmental groups came along with that disingenuous use of the word green by corporations. Another word that this has happened to is the word sustainable. It used to be used primarily by businesses to sort of talk about how they could sustain their business models indefinitely. But people also use it, in ways like sustainable growth. So I just, in my own community, we're rewriting our charter, and the Charter Commission proposed that we include as a value for our community in the environmental section of our charter that we have sustainable growth. And by that, I think they mean that they somehow mean that growth is somehow good for the planet, when actually sustainable just means it can happen indefinitely. And then with my work in Thacker Pass, I'm seeing a lot of groups and companies start using the term responsible, as in responsible mining. And it's just, again, it feels like they're just throwing this word responsible on the front of it to make it sound good, when in fact there is no way to make it good. So the first question for you all is, how do you think corporations use these words to pacify us into believing they are helping rather than hurting the world? And why do you think this strategy is so effective with people? So jump in, anybody.
I wanted to just say that I think that corporations use psychological consultants all the time these days. And I mean, there's no accident that they're using these words and these messaging systems. They pay a lot of money to figure out how to communicate their message of continuation of what they do.
Yeah, just adding on to that, I think people would obviously be concerned about environment, right? For assured reasons. They see the environment degraded, they see their lifestyle being affected because of environmental degradation. And what these corporations are doing is just like providing them an interpretation of their experiences, where if you just stop using fossil fuel vehicles, it would be all right. All of the degradation would be gone. So I think it's just channeling all of the dissatisfaction that we have against the environmental destruction and channeling that towards our actions, which are not going to be good at all.
I think they're really taking advantage of the fact that most people in this culture aren't going to look any further than the word green. They're not going to do the research. They're not going to know anything more about the particular industry. So they can really just get away with changing the language and completely changing their appearance that way.
Why do you think people fall so easily for this? It just seems strange to me that people buy this from these corporations.
I think we've got into a state we find it easier to believe a word than what's going on before our eyes. Now, I know a lot of this mining, etc., is hidden from people unless they go searching for it. But I think we've got into a psychological state where if you saw a car crashed in your street and somebody said, "Oh, look at that car driving past," they would actually believe the word over what they can see, because we've got so alienated. And language is used all the time, everywhere in that way. For example, you get a carton of yogurt and it says healthy, and everybody believes yogurt is healthy. So they overlook the fact that mountains of sugar have gone into that yogurt, and that it's probably the most unhealthiest thing that you could possibly eat.
Being someone who's been financially challenged, I hope you were done. So I think also that what might play into it is that people are so busy working to try to provide for themselves and their families, and it's exhausting. And civilization kind of provides these little breaks and respites from that exhaustion. And so when citizens learn of the environmental concerns, then it's very easy for civilization to just say, oh, this is green, just switch over and use this product instead, etc.
I don't think it's that surprising, since everything is commodified within capitalism. Like, why does anything work? Any product? Why do we buy any of all this stuff that we're being sold? I think it's just to be expected that they would take people's anxiousness over environmental destruction, or I don't know, any concern about the natural world, and they would take it and make it into some kind of product, or take it and use it as a way to continue to exploit. I mean, it fits with what the system is usually doing all the time, that they're always pretending to provide when they're destroying things. So if you're not provided with a third option, you might think that this is the only thing that you got. And it feels like it has to do with the people you encounter as well.
It all seems to always go back to when we've disconnected people from a way to live on the land, then they believe they need the system. And so anything the system does to make them feel better about that, even if they only feel that disconnection from the land unconsciously, it makes them feel less, it makes them feel okay about that.
As Siri was mentioning, because the cooperatives are driven by capitalism, basically, anyway, and capitalism has also mentioned in the book the Jevons paradox. The more you get available, the more you end up being depending on it. I mean, and people are scared to lose whatever they have become kind of dependent on, and they also kind of want to buy their self into better confidence or conscience.
I also think it's just convenient to do that, because we're facing a really big problem in which all of us should take the responsibility, and right now we could just shift that responsibility to the corporations. So they will do the job. They will be green, and all we have to do is just support them by buying their products. It's easier that way.
So I have been keeping up with the topics that are covered in the book for quite a while, so I wasn't particularly surprised by anything in the book. I learned a lot of details that I didn't previously know, and I found the chapters on efficiency and recycling particularly interesting, because I hadn't really realized the process for recycling, for instance. It's shocking to me how incredibly toxic it is, and how much material is lost in the process. I think corporations that claim to be green talk a lot about recycling as if that is going to solve our problems, and the book very, very clearly makes it clear that that's not the case. And also the topic of efficiency, I think they did a really good job of making it clear why that is so ineffective. And it's because it is very counterintuitive. When I talk about this stuff, people always want to respond with, well, the more we make things efficient, the better things will be. And that's easy to understand or think you understand. So I think it's a counterintuitive idea. And I think that chapter in the book does a pretty good job of making that clear why it's not true, and to help people understand that. So, but I wanted to ask you, what ideas from the book did you find surprising? Were there ideas that in the book that helped you understand, or were there sections of the book that helped you understand some of these ideas better? Were there places in the book where you got confused, or you think the authors could have done a better job?
I really liked their 9-page section on real solutions. And I just want to elaborate on the idea of restoration as a solution, and get a little deeper about the scientific basis. All the science we've received on climate so far is based on physical science, because that's what they can make numbers, and that's what they can turn into numbers and put into computer models. And if you look at the IPCC reports, the assessment reports are modified by the term, the physical science basis. So what this means is they're ignoring the biological science. They're ignoring the role of trees in cooling localities. They're ignoring the role of water and soil. So I feel like this is a really necessary thing for all of us to learn about. And there are people doing this work who have made tremendous discoveries. One of them is, if anybody wants to learn about water, it's called A New Water Paradigm. You can Google that, and you can learn about the powerful role of water and keeping water on the land and how that will regreen and transform a landscape and actually cool it and modify the climate extremes. So they touch on that in their 9-page Real Solutions part, but I felt they could have probably included some more information about that. But this is new information. I'm not sure many people are aware that we are all operating on an assumption that is based purely on non-life. And just to add to that, since I think patriarchy is a lot of this, in science, they say the physical sciences are the hard science and the biological sciences are the soft science. So they have this male bias. It's pretty deep and pretty interesting that we are all working on kind of peering through one lens of the glasses and ignoring the other one, which looks at nature and life and more feminine principles. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Yeah. That is really interesting and a very good point.
Yeah, it reminds me of something that Lierre Keith said, which is we just have to get out of the way. It seems to be so hard for us to actually do that right now, especially this culture. But that's basically what we have to do, get out of the way and let nature come back.
Yeah, like they say in the book, life wants to live, and we need to trust that given the chance, it will repair itself, but hopefully before it's too late.
I was curious that they didn't talk about population as much as I thought they might. Recently, I was talking about the new infrastructure bill with my husband, and I said, wouldn't it be great if it didn't pass? And so we had this whole discussion. He said, well, how are you going to kill all those people? And I thought, my God, that's a shocking statement. But really, how are we going to kill 7 billion people, 7.5 billion people? How are we going to do that? How are we going to please, yes.
First of all, maybe let nature run its course more, maybe.
I was curious about that too, and I also wonder if maybe they chose not to talk as much about population because it is such a divisive issue. And, as soon as you start talking about that, then people fall into these, immediate camps of, well, I'm not even going to look at the rest of the book because this population issue, hits my button so strongly. And then also, one of the solutions in the solutions chapter is, to educate girls and give women autonomy over their bodies. And, I've seen other studies that show we did that, and if people dramatically reduce the number of children that we have, we could address the population problem without having to kill anybody fairly quickly. I mean, much more quickly than people might imagine. I mean, I don't see that happening, but it's doable.
And I feel that, if I may break in here, I feel that if we aren't willing to put in the effort to raise the condition of women and girls around the globe, we really aren't going to save the planet. We aren't going to do any of the things that we need to do. So for me, it's very frustrating when population is treated as this great mystery. How will we ever lower the population? And I feel like that's assuming that that's within a world that only pretty much only knows patriarchy at this point. And it's very frustrating for me that people assume that we're looking at like mass death or something instead of something very simple and something that should have been happening all along.
Yeah.
And also, many people are being killed off by the opioid crisis and by neglect of their environment and in neglect of their way of making a living. Look at the Indian farmers who committed suicide. I must admit, I am one of those people whose button gets pressed by the population thing because it's always been a kind of far right thing, and they home in on how many, there are too many people. And when they're talking about too many people, it's too many black people. And, well, you know the arguments. They never mention the fact that, I don't know whether I've got this fact right, but there are 3 chickens for every human. And that there's a paw print as well, you know, for all the dogs and cats and all the pets in the world, that it's not just a human footprint that's got a population issue. It's the cow hoof print as well.
Yeah, the massive industrial farming required to support the population of humans is a huge impact.
And also the most devastating part of population increasement is in Western industrial countries, because in poorer countries, they don't have the footprint that we do. We consume way more than they do. And also there are the poor countries that suffer the most from the climate change and everything. And everything's just so unfair.
Yeah. And also it's completely tied up with the religion of economic growth, in the sense that governments understand that if populations go down, then economic growth is smaller or negative, and they don't want to see that because the global economy currently requires growth to function. So then you see countries actually trying to pay people to have more babies in countries where population is going, or growth is smaller, and so it's this perverse connection between, going back to what we were talking about earlier, about people seeing the economy and our way of life and the system as the thing that's keeping them alive. And part of that is, population growth to provide that boost to economic growth. And so it's all intertwined and connected. We have to solve all of it at once. In recent weeks, Biden's talked about building domestic supply chain in the U.S. so that the U.S. is less dependent on China and other countries for materials. So right now, there's a lot of mining happening in other countries that the U.S. is dependent on for materials. For example, solar panels and wind turbines. Most of the mining for those green energies happens overseas or in foreign countries. So as a result, a lot of people here in the U.S. don't really understand, where those things come from. I think in talking with people about Thacker Pass, most people had never even thought about where lithium comes from before discussing it. So we push those industries either into the poorest parts of the United States or into the poorest parts of the world, so that so-called developed countries and wealthy people living in the cities can keep the impacts of those industries out of sight and out of mind. And that also enables us to think of green energies like solar and wind and batteries as clean. So part of me wonders, as Biden is talking about bringing that supply chain to the United States, if that would help people in the United States to see that connection between these technologies and the actual impacts on the land, and how we've been exploiting poor people and around the world, including in the US. On the other hand, I see how people in the United States are proud of being coal miners, for instance, when, there's been a lot of press over the last decade about the shutting down of coal mines in West Virginia, for instance, because of policies put in place by Obama to reduce domestic dependence on coal. And the people there are proud of being coal miners, and they are angry that the mines are being shut down because that's their livelihood. And so it's this weird conundrum of, on the one hand, we don't want to be pushing the dirty industries off to the poorest people here or in other countries. And on the other hand, if people here become dependent on those industries for their livelihoods, then it seems that it doesn't seem to help people to understand that we can't keep relying on those industries because of the impact to the environment. So I'm curious, especially for people here who are in countries that have been dramatically impacted by mining. I mean, Canada, for instance, has been hugely impacted by mining. China has been hugely impacted by mining. I know Nepal has been impacted by mining. So I'm curious what other people think about that weird thing that happens.
Now, I'm just thinking about what you said about coal mining and people working in mines and such. I think that it's if we focus as much attention as possible on like the biggest exploiters, I think that we can build coalitions with all kinds of people. Because personally, I don't feel like the issue is with coal miners or individual consumers having cars, for example. But most people would say that the people that own the mines or the billionaires shouldn't have access to the wealth that they're stealing. So I think that we don't have to feel that there's an issue between environmentalists and people who are dependent on destructive industries. I think that we can work together. I just wanted to put that in.
Trinity, I'm curious what you think about this, because Colorado has been hugely impacted by oil and gas. And I'm curious what, in your experience, do people in Colorado see that overwhelmingly as a good thing, or do they see the connection with climate? Is there awareness that the oil and gas industry in Colorado is damaging the environment?
It's mixed. A lot of people are very concerned. There's a combination of survival mode. There's a lot of tent communities out here that count, and they're not that concerned. And there are a lot of people who've created their little cul-de-sac communities out in the beautiful, what were once boonies and grasslands, and totally destroyed the area. And now there's an extinct fracking well leaking all this toxic stuff outside their school, and they're very concerned. Like, I put in my time and I bought my little McMansion, and now this unconstitutional. It's very much entitlement based, and so I don't think there's an understanding about the underlying extractive nature. I think that when people have been so defanged and declawed and stripped of their relationship with the land, and I think a lot about what you've been talking about what makes a person indigenous. I was born here. I didn't choose that. I was brought here by a couple of irresponsible children, foisted upon the world. So now what? I have to teach myself who to go to, how to find people to teach me how to establish these relationships with the land. And that's incredibly difficult. That's incredibly difficult and pretty much impossible to do alone. You have to find people. And it's much easier to just buy an indulgence if you can afford to.
That's a perfect way of putting it, Trinity. Yeah, it really feels like people don't necessarily see that connection until it affects them personally. And certainly I've seen that in responses to Thacker Pass, where people say, but it's better than coal, oil, and gas to have lithium is better. But if they're the ones who are living where that mine is happening, then maybe they would feel differently. Because if they have a connection to that land, or they have a school there, or whatever, it sort of feels like I go back to this idea of, we humans are meant to live in a place, be deeply connected to that place with a small group of people. And this idea that we can somehow extend our empathies beyond something small, maybe we're just not capable of that. I don't know.
Yeah, when talking about miners and stuff, I kind of feel like there's a connection also with entrepreneurs, because when entrepreneurs are getting the work to build a wind farm, there's a lot of fights between resistance people and the entrepreneurs, and making it about them doing a devil's work and everything. But the thing is, they're just fighting for their right. The thing is, it's not quite the same as with miners, because they also completely destroy the environment around them. And last year, the way I found Bright Green Lies was because I was doing research myself on working on an article about wind turbines and how devastating it is from the beginning to the end. And so, as you said, Elizabeth, the book Bright Green Lies wasn't really so much new stuff for me either, but very much more detailed and very brilliant, because I've been lacking something that really has it all sorted in perfect chapters and very well put, and with humor as well. I love the humor, and I love the red thread with the polar bears doesn't do it for me. how that's going the whole way through the book. It's brilliant. So yeah, basically and even the recycling wasn't really new to me either, and that's quite surprising actually, because because our television, our national television, is bought up by corporations, and especially the green ones, and everything is called green, renewable, sustainable, and every time someone is having an activism against something, it's just ridiculed. Sorry, and it's so obvious that they have been bought to advertise this as something we need to keep doing, and that also is a big part of the brain conditioning of people, having the national television build around this lie. And we also are facing a lot of mining now, because during the research about wind turbines, I learned a lot about Baotao and everywhere where these things are made, and how it was like reading about Interstellar, how everything is just going to the end, and that's, I suppose, also people are maybe so frightened by that, so they cling on to Elon Musk and the thought of colonization on Mars, because we are fucking up this planet so much that we need somewhere else to escape to, because we are not able to turn around.
All right. I don't know if anybody read, there was a recent negative review of the book that focused on eco-humanism. And there was a couple of points in that review that I wanted to talk about. First, the review talked about how we need a transition to an earth-friendly society, but the reviewer gets away without really specifying, without articulating what that would look like. But then provides this negative review of the book because the book doesn't have more details about solutions. And so the other point that the reviewer made that I wanted to respond to was that the person said, the earth can't support 7.8 billion hunter-gatherers. And, even if the earth was in great shape, it wouldn't be possible. And to me, that this is, I think of this as a red herring, in the sense of, people immediately seem to want to jump to the conclusion that whenever we suggest that we take steps to improve the situation by stopping the destruction, that what we're suggesting is that everybody go back to living in caves, or we all immediately jump to we're all going to be hunters and gatherers. It's like they can't envision taking a step in the right direction without having some endpoint in mind of what they think we're suggesting, whereas they never are held responsible for describing what their endpoint is for their particular solutions. They get away with saying these very vague, generic things like transition to an earth-friendly society without really talking about what that is. And so it seems unfair. And I'm just curious what you all think about. It seems to be like a double standard.
I am not really surprised by that, because we see double standards everywhere. Whenever there's power involved, like there's always a different standard for the oppressor and the oppressed, and every time, right? So it's just in this struggle, they're much more powerful than us, and somehow that also means power of deciding the standards. So they can really discriminatory, I'd say, in terms of how they decide the standard for us and for themselves.
Yeah. But even like well-meaning environmentalists do this, right? I got into a Facebook discussion once with somebody I know who is a well-meaning environmentalist, and their solution is to, nuclear, right? We're going to get all our power from nuclear. And, they brought up but are you suggesting that we all go back to living in caves thing? I mean, I see this over and over and over again. And I'm like, so what is your vision for where we end up if everything is nuclear? And they don't want to talk about that. So it's not even people who, I guess they're unconsciously maybe aligning themselves with what we would call the oppressor. But, personally, I know they're well-meaning environmentalists, and they still do this, and it's incredibly frustrating.
No, I just think that it shows on a pretty narcissistic way of thinking, Most of the time also because these people usually would criticize something about the facts, and when they can't criticize the facts, they will switch to criticizing something else, and then they will say this, oh, so what's your end point? As you say, as if we're responsible for that. But also that if the authors of the book are only talking about the life of the planet, they're talking about the victims. They're talking about all the people and all the species that are dying. And if your response to that is to talk about whether you're going to live in a cave or not, that's very, very narcissistic. And it's not even bad living in a cave. I mean, I can't even get that criticism at all. But so I think that if we switch the narrative to like really listen to and talk about the people being affected. I mean, those starving polar bears don't care about recycling, and they don't care about what kind of stove you're going to use or blah, 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 what kind of city you're going to live in.
I think that for me, some of that is a defensive response to you're making me lose my map. I've been told that we've got this, and now you're coming up against me and you're telling me that this isn't accurate, this doesn't apply. So there's a knee-jerk defensive, I'm going to fight you back psychologically by calling you absurd. And I think that that's one of the things that here with this group is we had a transformational moment with me reading Endgame, where the whole thing just fell apart. Lost it all. And I love the way that this book at the very beginning mentions Lewis Mumford and Technics and the Mega Machine. I think that you can't talk to those that are clinging onto it. But if you can get that aha moment of, oh my gosh, here's a big picture that I can that is true, that is accurate, then all those little facts and figures fall into place. But I think that that's a psychological mechanism of fighting back. And you're talking to somebody that is not willing to be lost. They're not willing to let go. They're desperately fighting psychologically not to deal with it. And we do. So for me, the pivotal point is, where do you get to that psychological point where they are willing to let go? And sometimes it's because you're right next to that fracking well and it just blew up. Your neighbor just blew up. And sometimes that doesn't work either. You know, you're a cog in a mega machine and you have no idea that another world is possible at all. That's really desperately frightening and sad that a lot of human beings are in that state. And the war has been so pervasive for so long that they accept all of that as just collateral damage, because I have to keep on believing in this lie. So anyway, I wanted to mention Lewis Mumford because that really, really got to me. And I was so excited about seeing that and being reminded. And I got reminded by Jor, too, that he's doing this this video essay based on Mumford's techniques. Great minds come together, and we're in really good company.
When I first heard the phrase transition to an earth-friendly society, I thought it just sounded just as vague as green or sustainable. But now that I think about it, actually, yeah, we do need to do that. And we do that by dismantling industrial civilization, because it's fundamentally not earth-friendly and it never will be. So that's it.
Yeah, Jennifer, I had written down exactly what you said, that the challenge is to get people to let go and to be willing to make a leap without knowing where that leap leads. And that's really, really hard for people.
I think the hardest thing about it is that you have to let go of the I. Everything is about I. And that communal sense of we, that is what feeds us as human animals, has been driven out of us so completely that it constantly becomes about I. But we really don't belong there. Yeah. So sad.
Sort of following on from this discussion, the book and the film both describe this disconnection that we have from physical reality that most people must maintain in order to promote more technology as a solution for the extinction crisis, the pollution crisis, the energy crisis, and so on. One way I think the book and the film do this really well to illustrate this is to talk about the calculations that people like Mark Jacobson and others do to replace fossil fuels with renewables. And I think the film just did this brilliantly. So Jacobson's plan would require 2.4 billion tons of steel, 1.9 million tons of copper, 2.6 billion tons of concrete, and other stuff, adding up to about 60,000 Hoover dams of material. And to me, this was really a key point in the book and in the film to illustrate that anyone who thinks that using those materials to build out all those renewables just must have this unbelievably, profoundly disconnected from the real world in order to believe that that's okay, to believe that that would not destroy what's left of the living world. It seems obvious to me, but it's really difficult for other people to see this, apparently. And I think the way, Julia, that you mixed Mark Jacobson's statements about this with Derrick's responses to it was just brilliant in the way that it just highlights exactly this point. Derrick and Max both highlight how many bats and birds wind turbines will kill, and note that, the people who talk about wind turbines always say, well, buildings and cats kill more, as if that somehow makes it okay to make wind turbines to kill even more birds and bats. And again, that just perfectly illustrates that disconnection from nature very well. So I wanted to ask you all, what aspects of the book or the film do you think illustrate this disconnection very well? And if you haven't read the book or seen the film, if you have an experience from your own life that illustrates this well for you.
I was having a similar argument to the one you described with a well-meaning guy who you could say cared about the earth in a kind of way, but is machine loving. He now makes machines that makes machines, and he described that as the most perfect job because it was, achieving that ultimate utopian sterility in his mind. I'm projecting like I'll get out, but I think that because the direction that the argument went pretty much exactly as you described, this ultimate technocratic solution oriented mindset. And I think there's this assumption of oblivion and a kind of comfort in the irresponsibility of that. And I've heard this over and over again as I recall arguments that I've had, that as soon as you let go, like you were talking about, you become responsible. You have to participate in the hive. You can't just cop out or buy out. You have to try. And that's not easy. And letting go in the other way might be easier. It might be easier to just say, oh, well, I'll see you at the apocalypse. And everybody just kind of holds their breath and waits for it and doesn't try anymore.
Julia, I'm curious, since you made the film, was that moment when you were talking to Mark Jacobson just like an incredibly powerful moment? Yeah, I'm just curious, when you were talking with him, like, how did it make you feel in terms of that disconnection from reality?
Yeah, it was pretty amazing because anytime I would bring up the effects that this would have on birds or bats or the real world, he just really, downplayed it and made it seem like a small and trivial thing, or comparing it to things that are worse. And, always went back to comparing it to fossil fuels as if it was a choice between one or the other, as opposed to, this is really just stacking on top of everything else. But it demonstrated to me kind of what the argument tactics are that they will use. It was really eye-opening in that way. And as you were describing the materials that would be required to make these things, I'm thinking that's the complete opposite of an earth-friendly society, isn't it? But yet it's called that. It's just completely insane. I don't know how people can be so disconnected. You just don't look at it, I guess, out of sight, out of mind. We're just going to pretend that wind turbines grow on trees and solar panels sprout up out of the ground and not look at what goes into making them at all.
Yeah, that pile-on, when you were describing it, Beth, it sounded, like they're ranting and delusional. And it reminds me of, like water in the West out here. and Thacker Pass and thinking about that. So you're going to do what with water that isn't even there as the reservoirs dry up? That's the ranting of delusional people, just talking about how all of this can happen, but it's not there. It can't possibly be there. All those dams and all that.
Yeah, this culture creates a lot of delusion.
Yeah, I think civilization is a constant barrier between us and the physical world. Every time you go to the tap, that's water coming to you via technology, isn't it? Food, every time you go to a supermarket, that's food coming to you via tons of different types of technology. So it's a constant barrier. I remember on scout camp tasting water from a spring for the first time in my life, and there might be people who've never done that. There might be people that have drunk water from the taps for their whole life, and that's really sad.
I was checking out intentional communities online on YouTube, and I've actually lived in those kind of places for short times, and my lifestyle, it's always been really, but it's very frugal. You'd call it radical simplicity, I suppose. But anyway, while I was watching all these intentional communities, I felt very depressed, and I didn't know why I felt so depressed. They really depressed me, and I had a feeling like, oh no, I don't really want that. And then I tried to remember that the happiest times I'd had was if I was doing some gardening. So I tried to shake that off. I think the clutter we have around us, we think it is us. We think that the stuff around us is us. Now, I haven't got much stuff. I haven't got a car. I walk everywhere. I live off a lot of food waste. So if I find that depressing, and I'm fairly close to that lifestyle, somebody who's got a much more materialistic lifestyle might find that a hell of a leap to go there. And so they can only think in terms of this or hell in a cave as they see it.
All right. So the final question is, do you think that the book and the film will change people's minds? So really that's a question about, do you think that humanity is humble enough to ask those questions that the authors propose to ask about all technologies and about civilization, throughout the book, or not? And I'm curious, as part of that, Julia, if you want to chime in terms of if you've heard from people who have said specifically that your film or the book has changed their mind.
Yeah, I think it'll definitely change individual people's minds, and I have definitely heard from people who have said that the film has changed their mind about these things. People who are involved in environmental groups, and they're like, oh no, we've been promoting all the wrong stuff and we're going to change that now. So that's been really cool to see. At the same time, I don't know that just changing people's minds is sufficient. I mean, it's good, but it's not enough for people to have an opinion about something unless they're actually going out and stopping those industries. Because we're not changing the minds of the people who are actually in control of this, or actually, doing the mining and doing all this.
Yeah, precisely, because the thing is, we need to kind of attack where it matters the most, because changing people's minds can maybe be a bit easier than actually removing the problem. I mean, easier. Reading the book and watching the documentary, I found myself also reminiscing about how it was, because where I grew up, we had power breakdowns quite a lot, and I kind of always treasured those moments the most, because it made you really appreciate all the simple things that we and also how we do not need all the things, all the materials around us. The most important thing is to be with each other and kind of surviving, and how that kind of should be sufficient enough, rather than owning so many things, or even, because I do have a lot of materialistic friends, how it kind of makes me, I'm happy for them when they are appreciating some extensions, or how they have done their nails and how they do that every month. And I know it's small things, but I become so sad, because I wish they could realize that these things aren't what matters. Really, how having too many things makes you depressed, and kind of underlines how the saying, if you own more than 7 things, the thing starts to own you. And I kind of understand that more and more. And having too many things, it is a part of making you less connected to nature and life and what's really important.
Yeah, I've heard it called the G.I. Joe fallacy, that knowing is half the battle. I definitely don't think that's true. And a lot of research, evidence-based research, indicates that is untrue. And I think that a lot of smart people tend to, or at least kind of traditionally, cerebral people, I guess I would say, tend to think that if they analyze and they write and theorize, that is necessarily doing something. And I'm guilty of this. I was an academic, and it got me absolutely nowhere. And it got the world, I don't think, very far either. I guess my students would be the ones to ask, but I felt like it was largely ineffectual. I feel like I wasted half my life. And I think that until we're willing to actually build the communities that we want, that until we actually are going to model 2 things. One is building these actual communities and educating people and training people in basic skills and stuff like that, and actually making it fun, making it look like a better life, which it is, than the one that late capitalism is offering. Until we do that, it's all abstract. And then there's the frontline activism that has to happen, which is like actually stopping the destruction. I'm not saying that thinking and writing have no place. I'm certainly glad that Bright Green Lies was written, but I think it's time for the next phase now. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what the problems are. I don't think it's actually that complicated. The question is like, what are we going to do about it? What is each of us going to do about it? That's it.
I think that at the heart of every community, there's vision, and that artists and films and books provide that core vision that is absolutely necessary for community formation. So I think that this is essential. And I also think you need all of that building that comes from it, that comes from those sparks and those foundations. I think that human culture works that way, that now it's up to revolutionaries. I think, like, the people in this group, how well do we lead? How well do we draw community together? Pulling people in big enough groups that it becomes a community norm. Oh yeah, we know this. We've got this. We understand this.
Like, in terms of activism, I always think of it as every person goes through a journey, a process, right? So I think books and movies like these just help people go one step forward on that. But when we read it, we who already know that the renewables are not good for the planet, gives us some stronger arguments for any next time we face somebody who is for renewables. And for someone who actually believes completely in the renewables, even if after watching this film and reading the book, they still support the renewables, it would at least pose them with a challenge, right? So I think this would be taking anyone who reads this just one step forward to that action. I was thinking that I know it would work in an individual for an individual, but I did not know how effective it would be in the collective way. And well, Jennifer just answered it right before me, so thank you. That's a good point.
I've always been influenced by books and films. I watched Julia's film and I just thought, oh, that's really good. I wish I'd had that idea that, if I saw something that was wrong, I could just go away, get the skill I needed to put it right. I found that very inspiring. And when I think about it, all the things I've done in life and all the changes in opinion, really, nearly all of them came from role models in books or films. I mean, even recently, even when I was embracing the whole concept of civilization going down the pan, and that it has to go, I was very influenced by Jeff Gibbs's film, The Planet of the Humans. Everybody was so critical of it. And when I was arguing with people, because I got it straight away, it just did my view that he was telling the truth even more as I was arguing the case of the film. So I think the films and the books are very, very important, especially as we're also isolated. It's only because of hunting around on YouTube that I found Derrick Jenson and that I came across this group, or I wouldn't be here. So now I'm meeting all you people. So yeah, I'd say, act on it afterwards. But I think the work done for the books and the films is really important.
Yeah, precisely. Because I was just thinking when Jennifer spoke as well, how books always have infected my life from when I was a child. I learned so much about indigenous people and got really occupied with them and learning about how it's not them and us, really. We're all sisters and brothers and we're all part of nature and everything. But thing is, so from a childhood, both music, because I grew up in Pink Floyd, with The Wall and everything, and it really created my way of thinking. And so music, movies, books, everything, art is really crucial in order to make people make up their own minds and being interested and being curious about things. So, and I'm so grateful for Julia Barnes and everyone with working with the book and the documentary, because when I saw Planet of the Humans, it was quite right after I've been dashed by my article about wind turbines and been in arguments on Facebook, and I've stepped out of Facebook mainly because of it, because it's like I have a hard time dealing with all the biased and bogus arguments, like the cats killing birds, and even because I went up on the mountain here where they had some wind turbines a few years ago, and there was so much epoxy and glass fiber and everything, and I decided to pick it up. I was going there with my children and my mother just for a hike, and I wasn't prepared to see so much waste in the soil and in everything. So I started picking it up, and I wrote an article about that as well. But I was just humiliated about, well, just go to where you stop the car to have a picnic. Just go to somewhere like that and you'll find even more. And it's like I was just so tired, because the point is it doesn't make it better have these things and call it green, because when people throw things on the ground, trash, they're not being given subsidies, and they're not being paid to be green. Like Muse, I'm a huge Muse fan. And they have taught me a lot, because I always research. I'm a geek like that. And so when they made an album about the second law of thermodynamics, it made me go and research what's this, because the lyrics were so profound. And also the Resistance, which was based on Orwell, 1984. And even I had seen the movie ages ago, but I was too young to really understand the whole of it. But it made me want to, now I need to read the book too. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to chime in. I really did not want to set up a false binary there between, theory and practice or devalue art or anything of that sort. I think those things are essential to inspiring people. And I came out to Thacker Pass largely because of the beautiful art and writing that people were producing for this campaign. It really caught my heart, and so I think that work's very important. What I wanted to emphasize was just like, what's our next step with community building? Because I do think that what we've done, so art and literature can be used to that end, as well as to, sort of showing the destruction. It can also be used to build this other reality, So I guess I'm really interested in those uses of it. And so that was what I was trying to convey. And I think that is ultimately going to be more work than analyzing the situation, initially. So I do see us as having a lot of work cut out for us. And and I don't know how to get there any more than anyone else, but I am, really trying to shift and figure out what the next step is. So yeah, thanks.
And Sarah, I just, what you had to say was really struck me, that we're, for me anyway, it came that, we're taught to stay in our heads, that you can just stay here in this art, you can stay here in this kind of cerebral world with things, and that's not enough. And that's absolutely true. That's one of the games that gets played on it. Just leave it up there, but don't act on it. Don't take it into the body. Don't take it into your experience. So sadly, that happens in this culture a lot. We have to learn that, I guess. I'm stumbling a little bit now, but I appreciated what you had to say and what everybody's had to say.
And it is terrifying to take that next step. It's a heck of a lot easier to keep reading books than to take the step of putting your body on the line or talking to your neighbors and actually talking to them about this stuff, knowing that you're going to get potentially some negative feedback. I know it's terrifying for me to take those next steps.
In England, we've got lots of really brilliant working class sayings, and they're still current. Things like you're all talk and no action, and put your money where your mouth is. And I love those expressions because they're so linked to reality. And you still hear those, a lot of working class people have done degrees now. And so they're speaking silly language that isn't grounded. They're talking academic speak. And I mean, even that's written into our language. We say, oh, it's all academic, meaning it's not action, it's not in the real. And so they get the education has made them unreal. One of my things when I went to college, I couldn't stand that you'd have these lecturers and they'd be spouting revolutionary things in their books, and their lives were so in contrast to that. They were living lives the absolute opposite of what they were saying in their books. And what's lovely at the moment is, with one good thing about Extinction Rebellion, is that the academics are coming out, they're coming down to earth, and they're putting these silly jobs of theirs on the line. And scientists are coming out into the street, psychologists, and every other discipline, teachers, they're all coming out into the streets. And basically, they're getting real, because they more than anybody have been living a terrible, terrible lie. So I think what Sarah was saying about the academic life, it's not that their work hasn't been valid, but they weren't being real about it. They were just making money out of people on these courses, and they never intended that anyone would act out what they were putting forward.
By all means, I didn't mean to bash what Sarah said or anything. So most of all, actually, Sarah, I wanted to, while you were talking, I felt like I had to say, don't put yourself down, because how I listened to it is like you were down talking yourself and what you've been doing in your life and the impact of what you've ever been doing, even as an academic. But I'm sure that you, even as an academic, you have done some very important work, even if just for one person or an entire class. So yeah.
All right, well, with that, I was going to close with a couple of quotes from Derrick Jenson. The first one is from What We Leave Behind. He wrote, "Trying to force sustainability onto a functionally unsustainable culture causes severe cognitive dissonance and makes people suggest absurd solutions. No solution can be too absurd as long as it fulfills its primary purpose of keeping us from seeing that the culture can never be sustainable, and that to attempt to sustain this culture is to harm the world, the real physical world. Any solution that springs from the belief that the culture is more important than the world will not solve the problem." That seems appropriate for this discussion about bright green lies. The other quote, "With the world at stake, we should tell the truth." So thank you, everybody, for participating. I enjoyed this discussion.
This is Max Wilbert, one of the hosts of the Green Flame podcast. I want to thank you for listening to our show, and let you know a few ways that you can support the Green Flame. First, you can subscribe to our platform using the podcasting system of your choice. We're listed on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pocket Cast, and all the rest. We're even on YouTube. Leaving us a positive review or rating on these platforms helps us reach a larger audience. You can also share these shows with your friends. If you're interested in donating to support the production of the Green Flame, please visit deepgreenresistance.org. And finally, the goal of this show is to activate people. So if you really want to support this show, start organizing in your own community. Thank you again for listening.